Hi, I'm Whitney.
And I'm Camden. Welcome to Ghosts and Garnets, Murder in Idaho.
Murder in the morning. We're recording in the morning time. Not like vampires.
I am a vampire, so.
I know. You're an itty-bitty vampire. So guys, this is episode 6. Ceaseless, Dumbfuckery. The brothers Lankford. By the end of this episode, you will understand why I felt the need to put a swear in the title. You'll all be swearing by the end of this one. But I have to tell you, Cam, can you see my forehead?
Oh, yeah. What'd you do to it?
So I have a scratch on my forehead. We got a cat yesterday. And we have 2 dogs. And the cat, we've made her home in like my little podcast studio. And the dogs can't get into it. And she's just the sweetest thing in the world. She just is such a love bug. And
yeah, I can tell.
This was the dog's fault. So I was holding her and I opened the door to the room to yell something at Russ. And the dogs were both standing there and she freaked out and like hissed and scratched my face and ran back to the closet. Anyway, so now I have a scratch on my forehead.
A battle wound.
It is. And she's so tiny. She's not a baby cat because I don't do baby animals except for that one time, which I'm still living with regret every single day. Don't get a puppy, even during COVID. It's a horrible choice. We'll end up living with it.
Same. I went and got a St. Bernard baby, so.
Yeah, and that still is so strange to me that you have 3 dogs. Yeah, I like old animals. I mean, give me like the old and debilitated and sleepy and lazy every time. I'm the girl that goes to the shelter and gets the oldest animal I can find.
Well, those animals are the sweetest and loveliest.
Are you frozen or are you just making that face at me?
Which one? Again, this is morning. Morning is not my time.
All right. We did try to record this yesterday, and I know you guys know that we are not great at the audio, but it was a spectacular fail yesterday. So we're going to try this again today after my husband fixed it, hopefully. The story we have for you today is, well, it's just outside of Grangeville, where Camden lives. So it was a little added pressure this week to make sure that I got facts right. And this one is also tough because even though it happened 40 years ago, the perpetrators of this crime have managed to stay complete pains in the ass for the last 40 years. So the community and the families of the victims haven't really had time to just heal and sort of find peace with the whole situation because it just gets drudged up about every 10 years or so. So you guys are going to hear the story about that and be as frustrated as we have been for the last week.
Yeah, and then when we're done with this one, I hope we can just lock it away and never think about them again, but I don't think that will be the case.
Yeah, this is one of those, I cannot stress enough how totally senseless this entire situation was. I mean, murder is never, it doesn't make sense, but the motivation behind this is so disgusting and so stupid that it will boggle your mind. So we'll get into it. You want to get going, Cam, or?
Oh, I mean, I think I fell asleep again for a little bit. Ask Anyone who knows me and getting me out of bed in the morning is...
I'm glad I'm so interesting to you that you're just falling asleep as we're trying to record.
Well, no, you put me in a stare. Like, you have just this voice. Like, you could read me to sleep every night. It's soothing.
Okay.
When you're talking about murder or not. So
Russ asked me the other night if I ever felt the need that I maybe needed to talk to someone after, because I was bitching about this case to him. And he's like, with all this stuff in your head, do you ever feel like you maybe need to talk to somebody about, all this stuff? Does it disturb you? Or like, he was concerned about my mental health. And I was like, no, I'm not disturbed. Like a robot.
No, I am not disturbed.
Like, are you kidding? Like, this is stuff, this relaxes me. I don't know what you mean. If you're listening to this, okay? If you know, you know.
You know.
All right, Cam is gonna
But you didn't say your line.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fine, it's my line.
All right, get off my ass.
So the story we have for you today is the senseless, tragic, and seemingly never-ending nightmare that were the murders of Robert and Cheryl Bravens.
Cheryl Leto and Robert Bravens met when they were students at the university. Cheryl was the eldest of 5 siblings and was described as an angel. She never said a bad word about anyone, and she was so nice and so good to other people. Just a beautiful spirit. Robert was described as highly intelligent, ambitious, and well-respected. After college, Robert became a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps, and Cheryl became a special education teacher. They were both incredibly close with their families. The young couple were both athletic and adventurous and loved the outdoors. Robert was also a skilled mountaineer and a survival instructor. In June of 1983, Robert and Cheryl had decided to drive their green VW camper to Idaho to hike and vacation with their dog, Phantom, something that Robert had done many times throughout his life, starting when he was 11. They drove to Idaho from El Paso, Texas, and decided to camp just outside of Grangeville, Idaho. They were seen in Grangeville at about 6 p.m. on June 21st, where they made a phone call to Robert's mom to tell her they would be driving through Scottsdale, Arizona on the 29th and would see her then. They were then seen at an undeveloped campsite about 2.5 hours later. The next day, both they and their van were gone. Their Siberian Husky Phantom was found tied to a tree at the abandoned campground. I think one thing I want to say before we get more into this is that for people who don't know about Idaho County as an area, it's a huge county. It's the largest county in Idaho, but our population isn't that big. So if you think about Grangeville, there's about 3,500 people in Grangeville. So we're small, right?
Yeah.
So we're small.
It looks bigger, though, when you're there. Like, it feels bigger than 3,500 people.
Does it?
It feels bigger than McCall.
All right.
Okay. Right. So, in late June of 1983, FBI Special Agent Anthony Oldham was at his desk when he got a message from another agent that a woman named Gilda Howard had called reporting that her son and daughter-in-law were missing. Now, normally this isn't something that Agent Oldham would deal with, but the agent who gave him the message said that he had a weird feeling about it. So Agent Oldham called Mrs. Howard back. According to his book, Just Another Day in the FBI, Oldham said that she told him her son Robert was a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps and he was currently stationed in El Paso, Texas. He and his wife Cheryl had taken a trip to Idaho to do some hiking and mountain climbing. Robert had told her they would drive through Scottsdale, where she lived, before returning to Texas on their way back from Idaho. They told her that they would arrive on Friday the 29th, but by Sunday, she had become increasingly concerned when they still hadn't arrived and was genuinely afraid something may have happened to them. Agent Oldham traveled to Scottsdale so he could sit down with Mrs. Howard. She gave him names of relatives and friends and the contact information for Robert's supervisor in the Marine Corps, who also had not heard from him. Now, because they were traveling across the country and no one knew where they had gone missing, that's why the FBI is involved in this. Nobody knows if they went missing in Idaho or on their way back from Idaho. So this is why the FBI is involved and not a state agency at this time. So he opened a case and they started contacting local agencies and having the campgrounds in each of these states they thought they may have traveled through checked out. They flagged the couple's credit cards and banking records so they could keep track of any spending, and they obtained dental records, which makes me sad.
It's just so ominous, that statement.
Yes. So on July 5th, he got another call from Mrs. Howard saying that the Los Angeles Police Department had contacted the Marine base in El Paso after finding Robert's VW camper van abandoned at a bus station. There was little evidence in the van, but some latent fingerprints were taken, and the van did have some spent shotgun shells in the back. Eventually, the flag on the credit cards began notifying the FBI of use on the cards at motels, restaurants, and gas stations. The information they received was that 2 males were using the card. On several motel registration forms, they would scribble a name and put a fake address. Then the credit card information stopped completely. In the early morning hours of September 25th, Agent Oldham's phone rang. A couple of bow hunters who were hunting about 25 miles from the Bravens' campground had found some remains and notified local authorities. The authorities contacted the FBI and said they believed the remains of Robert and Cheryl had been found.
Agent Oldham then contacted a representative from the Marine Corps and asked that he accompany him to give the death notice to Mrs. Howard. Mrs. Howard came to the door, and she was told that Robert and Cheryl had been found. Agent Oldham recalled that Mrs. Howard stood proudly and asked if they would excuse her for a moment or two, and then she walked to another room where they could hear her crying. When she returned to the room, she said that all she wanted was to get her children back so that she would be able to give them a proper burial. Agent Oldham described her as a grand and dignified woman. The U.S. Marine Corps officer said he would remain with Miss Howard, and someone from the U.S. Marine Corps would be with her at her residence or immediately outside at all time until her loved ones were put to rest. They would be there for her and for anything she needed, and they were, from that moment on until the day that the young couple were buried. Once the remains of Robert and Cheryl were located, a crime scene investigation was conducted by the FBI and local authorities. The remains were covered by dense brush and tree limbs. It looked like they had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The Bravenses were beaten with such force that their skulls had to be reconstructed by an anthropologist before the cause of death could be scientifically determined. While taping off the area, investigators found a Camaro that looked abandoned less than a mile from the remains, and it appeared someone had attempted to hide it in the dense brush. A search of this vehicle revealed the name of the owner was Mark Lankford. The registration was from Texas.
I hate it.
I know.
I hate it. So let's talk about the Lankford brothers. And then hopefully never again will we talk about the Lankford brothers. So in June of 1983, Brian Lankford was 23 years old and was living in Texas. He was on probation for a robbery conviction when he decided to drive drunk and get arrested again. Fearing that this probation violation would land him in jail, he decided to flee the state. His older brother Mark, who was 27, and a former accountant for an oil company, decided to travel with him, and the two made their way to Idaho County, where they camped in the forest near Grangeville. Now, for some reason, these guys who clearly have had interactions with the law before should know more than this. I mean, they should know more than this. But they came to the conclusion that because Mark was delinquent on his car payments on the Camaro, that the police, who have nothing better to do with their time, would be searching for the car so that they could repossess it for the bank. So they decided they needed a new car. They needed to ditch the Camaro and get a new car so that they could avoid the non-existent arrest that was coming their way for the delinquent car payments. Idiots.
I was just going to say, idiots.
God. Now, this is what the authorities believe happened based on what they've been able to piece together from literally innumerable confessions and recantations and gibberish nonsense that they received from the brothers, which we're never really going to know. So they think the Lankfords, after hiding the Camaro in the woods, then hitchhiked to get to a picnic area down the road. Several people at the picnic area saw the brothers, one of whom was holding a shotgun. And it appeared they were sort of looking at vehicles in the parking lot. The picnickers became leery of the two men, and they packed up and left. At some point after that, the brothers came upon the Ravens' campsite and decided to take the van. They believe Brian Lankford walked into the camp with a shotgun, not holding them up with the shotgun, just like walking in and casually saying hello. And at some point, Cheryl went down to a nearby creek. At this point, they believe Mark Lankford ran into the campsite and ordered Robert Bravens to kneel down on the ground. Then, while kneeling, they think Mark hit Robert over the head with a nightstick. Cheryl then came up from the creek, and Mark told her to kneel down on the ground and hit her over the head with the same nightstick. They think the brothers then loaded the bodies into the van and headed back into the forest 25 miles from where they had murdered the Bravenses, and then hid the bodies under brush and tree limbs. Then they got in the van and traveled first through Oregon and then into California before ultimately abandoning it at the bus station in Los Angeles. Then the brothers returned to Texas, where they stayed several weeks with a friend of Mark's named Ray Ralmuto. They then traveled to a remote area outside of Plano, Texas, where they holed up in what was referred to as a rickety lean-to. Eventually, they were tracked down by local authorities and arrested there. Investigators found personal items belonging to the Bravenses, including a U.S. Marine Corps belt buckle and military-style green hat with the Bravens name written on the inside. After his arrest, Brian Lankford made numerous confessions regarding the killings. These statements included 2 statements made to Texas law enforcement officers, several statements, and a written confession to an FBI agent. Then he tried to kill himself and he failed, and then eventually made another statement to an Idaho County deputy sheriff after he had been extradited to Idaho, where he and Mark were both charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for a car.
For car. Right. And you said it when we were talking about it. I mean, just how senseless it is. They had a gun.
They had a gun.
Why didn't they use that to steal the car?
Well, that's what I was thinking is the authorities think that Brian walked into the campsite with the gun in his hand and like started a friendly convo. And then Mark ran in with a nightstick and that was like the threat. Why wouldn't Mark have run in with the gun and held them up with the gun? And then they could have just taken the fucking van. They didn't need to kill these people. There were no cell phones. They were far away from anyone else. No one was going to report them to the police before they could get out of the state. There was no reason. There was no reason.
That's why they're just evil.
Yes. Yes. And the fact that an anthropologist had to reconstruct their skulls, that's not getting hit over the head one time with a nightstick. That shows rage. It shows intent to kill them. This was not them getting tapped on the head to knock them out so they could steal the van.
Right.
It was intentional. For a fucking car.
Crazy. We can't try to understand crazy.
I know.
Even though we want to. Brian's first trial was held in March of 1984. And after the arraignment, Brian Lankford's attorney made a deal with the prosecutor. Brian Lankford entered a plea bargain in which he agreed to take 2 lie detector tests in exchange for a lesser sentence. And even though the results were somewhat unclear, they convinced the prosecutor that Lankford's older brother Mark was primarily responsible for the crimes and was the actual killer of both victims. Brian Lankford's attorney and the prosecutor agreed on an indeterminate sentence with a 10-year minimum in exchange for a guilty plea and testimony subject to commitment from the trial judge that he would impose that sentence. And for those of you that don't know, an indeterminate sentence is when they basically give a minimum amount of time, 5, 10 years, 10 years in this case, but they don't give an actual release date. And then the parole board can decide when they get out. So the judge refused to make such a commitment, and the case went to trial. Brian's defense theory was that he was only an accessory after the fact. He testified on his own behalf and stated that he was dominated by his older brother, who was a violent and dangerous person. He also testified that he thought Mark would merely knock out the Bravenses, and he had not pointed the shotgun at them upon entering the camp. Brian described one blow and added, "I think he struck the man another time." He said the blows were aimed both times in the back of the neck, actually, not in the head. Kind of across the neck in the back. He testified that Mark then struck Cheryl, also across the back of the neck, one time as I can remember, only once. It could have been more. I don't know. He actually destroys my will to live. Brian admitted that his emotions might have interfered with his perception. He also testified that after the murders, he was hysterical and remained in the van while his brother hid the bodies in the woods. Mark did not testify at this trial. The jury found Brian Lankford guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing was postponed until after Mark Lankford's trial.
So here's another thing. Bullshit that they did not hold this couple up with that shotgun. Bullshit. Robert Bravens was a Marine. Okay? The only reason that he wouldn't fight back when he knew that he and his wife's lives were being threatened is if there was a gun pointed at him.
Right. For sure.
Yeah.
No question. No.
Just so dim-witted. It's just astounding. It makes me feel stupid. It makes me feel like I'm less smart having to live with these two dummies in my head all week. I feel like it's actually made me lose brain cells. All right. We're going to talk about Mark's first trial. His first one. There's many. One of many. So rather than change the location of the trial from Idaho County, where the crime had been committed, they decided to bus jurors in from Ada County in order to get a non-biased jury pool. Grangeville logger Darrell Cox testified that he gave 2 men, one carrying a shotgun, a ride and dropped them off at the McAllister picnic area. Julie Castle testified that she and her family had gone to the campground for a picnic. She said 2 men were dropped off by another vehicle and they approached her family, spending about 15 minutes talking to them, glancing at the picnickers and their car. Her husband at the time, Chris, testified it was unusual to see 2 men with a gun at that time of year because it was not hunting season. And he also said the men remained longer than he thought was appropriate and was relieved when he saw them walk away and out of sight. And I didn't put this in, but I did read that this woman, Julie Castle, said that she thinks the only reason that they were not the victims is because there were too many people there.
Right.
Which is terrifying. Like, their kids were there.
Exactly. And when she testifies in court, having to testify in front of these men and seeing the pictures of what they did to the Bravenses.
Yes.
How traumatic.
Yes. Awful. So other witnesses testified that they saw the green VW van, and a former tree planter testified that the dog, Phantom, was left tied in the bushes. Andrew Dale, who was an employee at the Ranch Motel in Pendleton, Oregon, testified that he'd later rented a room to the 2 men in a green Volkswagen van and that they had used a credit card under the name Robert Bravens to rent the room. He said the men arrived before sunrise on June 22nd and asked for a wake-up call at 5 p.m. When he attempted the wake-up call, the men and the van were both gone. At Mark's trial, the state relied heavily on Brian's uncorroborated eyewitness testimony. Brian is an imbecile. I cannot even imagine how hard this was for the prosecution to have to use him as anything. Ugh. All right. So Brian claimed that Mark hit Robert Bravens, quote, twice. Could have been once. Throughout the 2 trials and in statements to investigators, Brian described the murder weapon variously as, quote, possibly a pipe, sort of a nightstick, maybe made of wood, a little limb deal, and a little club only 12 inches long. Following Brian Lankford's testimony on direct examination, Mark Lankford, contrary to advice from his counsel and the court, decided to act as his own attorney and cross-examine his brother.
This is my favorite.
It takes a very specific kind of narcissist to think that they are capable of adequately representing themselves in a court of law.
The narcissism is strong here.
Astounding amount. I mean, really, you just have to be equal amounts stupid and arrogant. It's fascinating to me. So I looked it up because I wanted to know what kind of narcissist this was, because I love cases where people try to represent themselves. I just find it like, let's see how I can make this worse for myself. And I'm going to do that. And I found this cognitive defect that they call the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's a type of bias in which people believe they are smarter and more capable than they are. Essentially, low ability people do not possess the skills needed to recognize their own incompetence.
This is so funny to me. I do too, because, I mean, just to walk into a room, you didn't go to law school, no. but you definitely can do a better job than they.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to think probably he thought it would really intimidate his brother too, if he questioned his brother. But I mean, the fact that he thought that he could do it, and it'll come over later too. He does this several times where he thinks that he's really going to wow people with how smart he is.
But alas.
But alas, 'twas not to be. So Mark asked Brian about all of the discrepancies in his stories. And Brian replied, "You told me not to give any statements. which is what I did until I broke down and told the truth. So after Mark's inadequate attempt at cross-examination did not succeed in breaking Brian of his 6 millionth story, the court asked that the attorney be allowed to resume his role as attorney. Essentially, they wanted Mark to sit the fuck down and shut the fuck up. And he did, momentarily. At this point, Brian decided he was tired of talking. It's too many words, just exhausting work, testifying against one's own brother. And he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege and refused to answer the lawyer's questions on cross-examination. Then Mark stood up at the defense table, grabbed his coat, and said, "I'm not listening to this lie. Y'all can stay here and listen to it. It's only about the 5th story, maybe the 6th story I've heard." And then he left the courtroom. He stormed out in a fit of rage.
I feel like these brothers' mother did not teach them about taking responsibility for their own actions and to grow the fuck up.
Yeah.
Is acting like a child.
It's tantrum central over there. I mean, really. I can't believe that he was allowed to stomp out of the courtroom. But he was. I mean, the judge didn't stop it.
But you can't, banish him from the courtroom after that because they need him to be there for his defense. It's like they were... I don't know.
The defense did not end up calling Mark to testify on his own behalf. But this was Mark's account of what happened based on his interviews and his lawyer's strategy. So Mark said the brothers had traveled from Texas to Idaho because Mark was trying to get away from what he perceived to be his materialistic life in Texas, while Brian wanted to escape an impending arrest for parole violations. They were going to, quote, live off the land in the Frank Church Wilderness, which if you have ever been to the Frank Church Wilderness, you would know that these two fucking dummies could not survive for one day, let alone live off the land. This wilderness is so dense and remote, you cannot drive in it. You have to hike through it. The best survivalists in the world think this is a harsh place to go.
Exactly. We have so many experienced hunters and wilderness survivalists go missing in the Idaho County forests.
Yeah.
Every year. And they're usually never from Idaho. And the families want to come in and help search for these people. They have no idea about what this terrain is like. None.
No.
And of course, they can do what they want, but the sheriff's office is does not want people out there investigating because then they're going to get lost themselves. I mean, there are cliffs and mountains and ravines, and it is just crazy. They're just going to live off the land. They make it sound like a little house on the prairie. Bozos.
Little house on the prairie.
Well, that's what they make it sound. They're going to go live off the land on their berries and their...
Yeah, no, I mean, it's crazy. People have no idea how dangerous it is to be out there when you have not a clue. I mean, these guys can barely get through life, in the regular sense. Narcissism.
Keeping dummies out there since the beginning of time.
So this is the story that Mark told. He said that Brian had very quickly decided that living off the land was not the life for him, and he wanted to return to Texas. So Mark said he gave Brian $50 and told him not to do anything stupid before deciding to walk back to the campsite. He said soon after, Brian drove up in a VW van. And after some initial hesitation, Brian admitted that he had attacked the owners of the van with the head of his shotgun stock. Mark says he insisted, because he's such a good Samaritan, that they return to the campsite, telling Brian it's not too late to save your ass, maybe. As the two neared the site, Brian grew increasingly nervous. He was chain smoking and driving recklessly. Once at the campsite, Mark said he spotted 2 figures lying on the ground in a pool of blood. He said he checked for pulses and announced to Brian that they were both dead, at which point Brian replied, "Are you sure they can't be?" Mark says he then confronted Brian about the shotgun stock story, and Brian's response was, "It was just like I said, but after I hit the woman, the man started trying to get up, so I hit him again. He went down, but was still moving a little. I hit him again, but he wouldn't knock out, so I saw this rock, I picked it up, and I dropped it on his head twice. He stopped moving. I picked it up again and hit the woman." Mark does at this point admit that he helped Brian load the bodies into the van and then helped him hide them in the woods. So the prosecution was able to make a really detailed timeline according to the last time that Cheryl and Robert had been seen and when the Lankford brothers arrived at that motel in Pendleton. According to Mark's story, the way that he tells it, there is no possible way, logistically, they could have made it to the motel in Pendleton, Oregon, from the campsite in Idaho County if the brothers had separated. So the story of them separating and Brian going and killing the couple and then meeting back up and then going back to get the couple and then driving 25 miles away to get rid of the bodies and then come back and make it to Oregon. It's just, time-wise, it's just not something that could happen. I think that was probably the nail in the coffin for Mark. Just the factual information of time. Facts. I think was so important.
Who knew?
Yeah. Despite Mark's courtroom antics and his story that was impossible to fit within actual Earth time, on May 4th, 1984, he was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. And then this guy, God, it's hard for me to not swear today. This guy sarcastically says to the jury, "Thank you. Thank you." That is what he says to them. Thank you. Fucker. I cannot.
Oh, right. So, after Mark's conviction, Brian recanted his testimony against Mark on multiple occasions. He also recanted his recantations. How he keeps track, I have no clue.
He doesn't. He doesn't keep track.
Oh, God,
that's why it's all just nonsense.
Nonsense talk. Brian contacted a local reporter in June of 1984 after the brothers had both been convicted, but before either was sentenced, where he confessed that he alone killed Robert and Cheryl. Before the sentencing, the trial judge ordered the prosecutor to notify the court and Brian whether it would seek the death penalty, and, if so, to file a statement of the aggravating circumstances on which the death penalty would be based. The prosecutor notified the judge that the state would not recommend the death penalty. Several proceedings followed, and at no point was there any mention that Brian might receive the death penalty. This is important because it will contribute to the mess that the case became. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor recommended a life sentence for Brian, with a minimum ranging between 10 and 20 years. The trial judge indicated that he considered Brian's testimony unbelievable and that the seriousness of the crime warranted more severe punishment than recommended by the state. Agreed. Despite the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, the brothers were sentenced to death on the same day. Because of Brian's spontaneous newspaper confession before sentencing, in October of 1984, at a hearing on Mark's first motion for a new trial, the reporter testified that Brian telephoned him to confess, saying, quote, "wanted the truth to come out," and admitting that he killed the Bravenses by knocking Mr. Bravens unconscious with a stick and then beating them both with a rock. In this version of Brian's story, Mark was not even on the scene at all. Brian also testified at Mark's hearing, admitting to the confession, but claiming it was a lie that Mark directed him to make so he would, quote, get out. Therefore, later, in 1985, Brian wrote a letter to Mark's counsel again, accepting full responsibility. So this prompted a subsequent hearing on Mark's second motion for a new trial. This time, Brian testified that he entered the Bravens' camp alone, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun, and ordered the couple to lie down. He crushed their skulls with a rock, a large boulder, he said, that was about a foot in diameter and probably weighed about 35 or 40 pounds or more. He sounds so strong. He struck each camper 3 or 4 times and then walked back to the road to enlist Mark's help in the hiding of the bodies. Brian described the Bravens' campground and his attack on the campers in detail and admitted that his earlier testimony against Mark was an attempt to save himself. The court denied Mark's motion for a new trial. So you're telling me, Brian, that you're murdering these 2 people and your good buddy brother Mark is just like out picking wildflowers along the side of the road.
Uh-huh. The fact that he cannot keep the murder weapon straight, he cannot keep how many times people were hit, the fact that he thinks it's believable that his 23-year-old criminal ass is going to outsmart and outmaneuver a U.S. Marine. I just cannot.
Here's what I'm telling you. I told it to you before, and I'll tell it to you again. Whitney, if I am ever with you when you commit a murder, I promise you I am going to know what your murder weapon was.
That's really all I ask. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The devil is in the details, really.
When he talks, the devil is in the details. True enough. But when he talks about using a stick or a limb, it makes me want to smash his face in.
Like these 2 people are just going to lay down and like let him beat him to death with a stick, and one of them's not going to do anything while the other one is getting beaten.
Yeah.
Come on, man.
Come on.
Gross. I cannot even believe that I am going to say this. But at this point in 1991, the United States Supreme Court here, Brian Lankford's appeal. I mean, how these 2, where's my synonym list?
Knuckleheads.
Thank you, knuckleheads. Guys, I had to download a synonym list for dumbass so I wouldn't just continue to say dumbass the entire day. The Supreme Court, in the death penalty case, they left intact his conviction. But the court said that Ryan's due process rights were violated because his lawyer had not been adequately notified that the trial judge was considering the death penalty. Because remember, the prosecution made a deal, the prosecution followed through with their end of the deal, and then the judge in Brian's trial declined to go along with the prosecution's recommendation for sentencing and sentenced Brian to death anyway. So his lawyer was not arguing against the death penalty during the sentencing phase. So what they're saying is because the lawyer believed Brian was confronting a life sentence, the lawyer did not produce evidence to argue against a death sentence. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the majority opinion, and he was joined by Justices Thurgood Marshall, Blackmun, O'Connor, and Kennedy. They ordered him to be resentenced or released. In 1998, Brian again contacted Mark's lawyer, asking to speak with him. At this point, Brian's lawyer had had enough. He said, I'm not going to represent you anymore if you insist on calling your brother's attorney every few years and confessing. Not doing it anymore. Brian ignored him, and in April of 2003, he wrote a letter to Mark's new counsel where he assumed full responsibility, confessing that he struck the Bravenses several times with a, quote, head-size rock. I don't think I've ever heard a rock described
As head-sized?
as head-sized. In 2006, Mark Lankford's original conviction and sentence were vacated by the Ninth Circuit Court, based in part on his argument that he had ineffective assistance of counsel because the instructions that his defense attorney gave the jury about their options on convicting him were not given correctly. The appeals court ordered Idaho to either retry or release him.
In an affidavit filed by the prosecution against an argument for bail prior to the second trial, Robert Lankford, Brian, and Mark's brother, who was an electrical engineer in Texas, said he and his family are afraid of Mark. Quote, "I fear for my family, and my family agrees with me that he will seek revenge on us all if he's let out." Robert described Mark as a sociopath of the first order, who might have killed at least 6 people in Texas. According to the document in which he also listed the 6 homicides he suspected his brother committed, he said Mark and their grandmother lived together for a period of time, and that a couple of girls were murdered in an area of Houston near where Mark lived. Robert said their grandmother feared for her life, as his mysterious behavior was leading her to suspect he had something to do with the disappearances of the young ladies. He also stated that at a Christmas gathering in 1980, their father said he found a body near a spot he took the boys fishing as children. Mark commented on the body being dismembered. Robert said, quote, "My father turned white as a bedsheet, then asked Mark how he knew that they had been dismembered, as that detail was never made public." He reminds me of Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, seriously.
Creep. But his grandmother wasn't, like, afraid of him, was she?
Oh, yeah. I mean, have you
Dahmer's grandmother was?
Yeah, have you seen the Netflix?
No, I mean, I've read a million things and seen a million documentaries about it. I just never heard that his grandmother was afraid of him. I knew they lived together and that he was, like, killed people in the basement while she was in the house.
Right. Yes, and there was terrible smell coming from... I mean...
Ugh.
I think she tried not to be afraid of him. It was her grandson, but... Anyways, I digress. Robert also said he believed Mark was involved in the mysterious disappearance of 2 women from a strip club in Texas.
Hold on. We got to give some importance to this next line that you're going to say because it's my favorite thing. I wish I could do like a dun dun dun.
You can. This next sentence, I can't even believe I have to say it. It's so good. He said Mark applied for a job as a stripper under the stage name Little Conan and was laughed off stage. I'm not shocked by that.
Little Conan.
Now, when we post pictures to our social media, you just picture this man getting on stage to strip for you with the stage name Little Conan.
I mean, you guys will see, and I don't even feel bad about saying this. This man is not attractive. This man, nobody wants to see him take his clothes off.
Nobody wants to see him shake it. Robert said he believed Mark, picked out those that humiliated his ego and waited for them in the parking lot where he abducted and murdered them later. Robert also believed Mark was involved in the death of an elderly man because in talking about the death, Mark talked about sinking, quote, a hammer off into his head. Robert said this phrase was the same Mark later used discussing the club that is believed to have been used in the Bravens case. Robert said Mark's concern for only himself dates way back. He was a career criminal with no conscience or consideration for others. You don't say. Bail was denied.
I can't believe bail was even an option.
I know, right?
Uck. Little Conan.
You get back in your jail cell.
I'm so tired of Little Conan.
We should have stickers made that say Little Conan. No, we shouldn't, because he's the worst, and we will not.
What kind of dumbass thinks that women enjoy any name with little in it? Does not strike up lust in my heart.
Maybe he was using it as like
ironically?
Yeah, like ironically. Thank you. I was drawing a real blank there. But like you said, I mean, he goes to a male strip club and he says, wait, sir.
Yeah.
I could do this better than any of you out there.
I cannot think of a job where I would be more horrified on a daily basis than if I had to watch men audition to be male strippers. I would literally expire of embarrassment. I would not be able to function in the world. Right now,
Same, I'm embarrassed.
I'm getting so
uncomfortable
thinking about it. Oh, God. Ew. Okay.
Little Conan auditioning for you. Oh.
Okay. We're going to talk about Mark's second trial, which took place in 2008. So this time the trial was held in Shoshone County, which is north. I should know this. North.
In Wallace.
In Wallace, Idaho, because of the widespread news coverage of the case in Idaho County. Among the first witnesses called were Cheryl Bravence's mother, Linda Leto, and Robert Bravence's brother, Andy. A court employee read testimony from the 1984 trial from Robert's mother, who had died in 2004. Leto identified a photo of her daughter wearing Robert Bravence's military cap. That hat, with Robert's name in ink on the inside, was found with the Lankfords when they were arrested near the Trinity River in Texas. The next to testify was a jailhouse informant named Lane Thomas, who said that Mark admitted to him while the two were incarcerated together that he had killed the Bravences. There was a newspaper article that I found so odd, where they said they described Mark as, quote, the boyish defendant, crew-cut and dressed in a gray suit and colorful striped tie, frequently jumped up to object to prosecution evidence. Most objections were overruled. End quote.
There's a real shocker.
Of course he jumped up. Of course he did. What else would he be doing during a trial?
Anyone describing him as boyish.
He's not a youth at this point.
Youth.
All right. So, Brian was going to testify again. Who knows what he's going to say this time? So he's going to testify again, and Mark's attorney cautioned the jury against accepting the word of Brian. He said he's a liar, and when he testifies, you will see that. I do not disagree. I don't think anybody disagree. In this trial, Brian stated again, never mind what I've been saying since the first trial. Mark did it. On February 13th, 2008, the jury convicted Mark Lankford of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So he did not get the death sentence this time around. So during sentencing, the judge stated, quote, the pain is racking the hearts and souls of the survivors. To take 2 beautiful lives and to eliminate them for their car and credit cards is beyond the pale. Judge Bradbury said he didn't believe Mark Lankford's story that he only learned of the Bravens' death sometime after they had already been killed. But if his story was true, that his actions of helping to hide the bodies and then stealing the couple's van and money showed a singular disregard for the rights of others, and it was callous at best. After the sentencing, Mark said, "I had no idea that Brian, in my wildest imagination, would kill 2 people. This is a travesty of justice. I was guilty of accessory after the fact. There are absolutely no winners in this series of events." Linda Leto, Cheryl's mom, was in tears following the hearing and said, "I'm just so happy the judge put him away for life." The prosecutor said he was happy for the victims and that he thought justice was served without a doubt, and he was just so glad that it was over. Unfortunately, it was not over.
On November 17th, 2013, the Idaho Commission of Pardons and Parole set a release date for Brian Lankford. It would be October 24th, 2018. When news of this reached the families of Robert and Cheryl, they were obviously incredibly upset. "Brian Lankford is a violent criminal," said Carrie Leto, the younger brother of Cheryl Bravens. "Why should someone like that ever be allowed to walk free?" Leto said the ongoing saga of the Lankford brothers has caused untold pain for his family through the years. Cheryl Bravens' parents both suffered heart attacks shortly after the murders and have since died. Robert Bravens' parents have also passed away. I can't even begin to paint a picture of how much stress there was on our family after this happened. Anytime that we think about all the stuff, it brings back all the original pain that really never goes away. Through the years, the family has stayed in touch with Idaho County and the state authorities as the cases have progressed through the court system. Allowing Brian Lankford to walk away a free man after all this time would be an injustice. There's already been numerous Marines who have already written to the governor to express their disapproval over the parole decision. Marines stick together even after 30 years. Those who knew Rob, they have no hesitation to help out. The decision was reversed after the uproar, and his release was eventually denied after a review by the board. Thank God.
Yeah, well, you know what's interesting is I didn't put this in, but the director of the commission for pardons and parole after this letter writing campaign and all of the public outrage said that the only reason that he was granted a parole date is because of a procedural error.
So he wasn't even supposed to get it.
No, he was. Like, they were going to let him out, but she just didn't want... She was like, no, it was an accident. Yeah.
All right, she didn't want to face the backlash. I got you.
Correct. Yes. Here we go again. On July 3rd, 2017, the Idaho Supreme Court overturned the murder conviction of Mark for the second time, ruling that prosecutorial misconduct in his second trial violated his right to a fair trial. In a 3-2 decision, the High Court ordered a new trial for Mark. The court found that prosecutors failed to disclose promises of leniency made to a witness, specifically that jailhouse informant who had testified about Mark confessing to him that he had killed the Bravenses. It was said that this informant was released from prison 3 months early and was promised help with his own sentencing. That, the High Court found, constituted prosecutorial misconduct.
September 9th, 2019. Mark's third trial would be in Canyon County. Canyon County Deputy Prosecutor Doug Robertson would lead the prosecution. This case would look a little different for a couple of reasons. First, many of the witnesses in the first trials had either died or couldn't be found, and this time, Brian was taking the blame. Brian Lankford, now 58 years old and dressed in an orange prison uniform, said he killed Robert Bravens first after Bravens refused to give him a ride. Brian Lankford said he then killed Cheryl Bravens too because he didn't want any witnesses. He said, and I quote, "I believe I was possessed at the time. Just a momentary possession." this guy.
Shut up, Brian.
Shut your face.
Ugh.
While he has 3 times claimed to be the sole killer, the details vary with every single telling. Prosecutor Doug Robertson spent the entire day going through each testimony and a handwritten letter Brian Lankford had allegedly written over the last few years depicting what had happened that night in 1983. He read testimony that Brian Lankford reportedly gave in the past about Mark Lankford being present at the murders. Robertson pointed out 3 instances that Brian Lankford has altered the details. In the 80s, for example, a shotgun was not included in testimony, but this time, Brian Lankford said he first hit Robert Bravens in the head with the butt of a shotgun. Robertson brought up a letter that Brian Lankford allegedly wrote 4 days after speaking to a Lewiston Tribune reporter. The letter stated that he had done something really stupid, and that he wouldn't let his brother get to him again. Also, at one point in the 80s, Brian Lankford said he knew his brother would try to get to him or kill him if he knew he was going to say anything. Brian Lankford did not recall making those statements. He said he was not scared of his brother or ever coerced by him. Robertson asked Brian Lankford if he thought his testimony was vastly different from what he said to the reporter in 1984 or at his 1986 hearing. Quote, "It's a matter of opinion, but the main thing was not different. The main part of the story is, I killed them." The examination became heated occasionally, as tension could be felt between Robertson and Brian Lankford, who would make comments about prosecution leaving out context. Towards the end, Brian Lankford frequently talked over Robertson. He claimed that prosecutors paid him to lie in the past and coached him on what to say under oath. He claimed that prosecutors offered him several goods and services, including releasing him from custody. "I said whatever I was advised to say," Brian Lankford said various times throughout the proceedings. "The truth is, Mr. Lankford, your worst fear in life is not to spend the rest of your life in prison," Robertson said. "Your worst fear is to spend the rest of your life in prison with your brother." To that, Brian Lankford replied, "That's just stupidity." Robertson said he provided Brian Lankford a large binder full of everything he has said on the record about the murders, and Brian Lankford said he received it and destroyed it because it came from the prosecution. He said, "You're the prosecution. You're not my friend." And to that, Robertson replied, "No, I'm certainly not."
So, here's what. I think that, the fact that the brothers are housed in the same prison, maybe not in the same unit or whatever, but they're both in the state correctional facility in Idaho. And I think for a long time, maybe Brian thought that he was going to get paroled in 2018. And when he didn't get released, then he's like, shit, I'm going to be in prison with my brother probably forever. And if I say he did it again, he's going to come after me. So I better just take it. And not for 1 second do I think it was one or the other. I think both of them were there. I think that's the only way they could have overpowered Robert or gotten him to lay down.
Right.
I just don't think that there's any other way. The total lack of awareness that these two have, that anyone listening to these stories is going to have the ability to think critically about what they're saying. They just really, I think it's so strange to me that Brian thinks that anyone is going to believe anything that he says.
It's like he thought that every time he said something new, they would automatically have forgotten what he had said in the past over and over again.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. It's wild. I can't imagine what kind of Neverland he's living in that he could get on the stand where all of the previous trials were recorded.
Yes.
And think that he could go on time and time again with a new story.
It's like I was saying earlier, I cannot imagine how many like face palms the prosecution did on a daily basis, having to deal with him.
Even his own defense. I mean, his own defense had to be like going just.
Yes, like shut up, man. Shut up.
I should be making more money. I should be making more money.
Well, and you know, all of these attorneys for them were court appointed. So it's just, you have to be the schmuck, like, representing these two. Ugh. All right. So, continuing with the overblown sense of self-importance, this time Mark decided to testify on his own behalf. When the trial judge began to explain to Mark that he had the right not to testify, Mark told him that it wasn't his first rodeo and assured him that he understood his rights and wanted to testify on his own behalf. He said, quote, "The court, the public, and the people, and the jury, I feel, deserve to hear me speak. Not a single fucking person wants to hear anything you have to say, Mark. From us to you, not a word."
He just wants to hear his own self.
Yeah. So Mark said on the stand he was not present when the Bravenses were killed. He claimed he never saw them alive, but he did assist his brother in placing their bodies in the van and leaving them in the woods. Lankford said he thought his brother's choice to kill the couple was for nothing. Prosecutor Justin Paskett asked Lankford why then he would help his brother cover up the murders. Lankford said, "He's my little brother." Then he explained he just didn't have the genetic makeup to turn on his family. Then Brian was called again because they just didn't get enough of him the first go around. Everybody needed another dose of Brian Lankford in this trial. He was questioned regarding some phone calls he had made from prison in October of 2018 when he said he would do anything to get his brother acquitted and would try to blow the prosecution out of the water. Brian said he did not recall making those statements. During closing arguments, Robertson said, "Mark Lankford has claimed he left his home and his job as an accountant for an oil firm in Texas to find himself. Mark needs you to believe that he's just fine, that he's up there on a spiritual journey, because if he's just fine, then he had no reason to rob and murder the Bravenses. If Mark Lankford is out for a car, why didn't he take the car from the man who gave them a ride? Mark Lankford may be a murderer, but he is not an idiot." Disagree. "The only choice is to come back and tell that man you see him for exactly what he is, that he is a murderer twice over." Mark's attorney, Sean Walsh, said Brian was the only one guilty of murdering the Bravenses. Mark Lankford has admitted to helping dispose of the bodies to help shelter his brother, but Brian Lankford did the killing without his brother present. Walsh painted Brian as a remorseless killer, a psychopath, who came in to testify, bound in chains and looking like Hannibal Lecter. Walsh avoided mentioning previous trials against Mark, but did tell the jury that Brian was offered a deal for early parole. He said that the prosecutor's office had bought Brian's testimony. Walsh told the jury that the only choice was acquittal. "You don't need to feel like a murderer is getting away," Walsh said. "The man who murdered the Bravenses is never getting out." He's talking about Brian, who has a parole hearing in 2023. Mark was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. He cannot go on.
When interviewed during the trial, Cheryl's brother Kerry said in comparison to previous trials, this time there was more emphasis on the possibility that Cheryl and Robert could have been alive following their beatings at the campground. Cheryl's brother said the evidence certainly leaned that way. A photo shown this time around, which I don't believe was shown at previous trials, has Cheryl's hand wrapped around a tree limb where the bodies were dumped. It can't be proven she was alive and trying to grab the tree limb. But if that was the case, it shows another level of the true brutality of these crimes and how horrible a situation Cheryl and Rob went through. It is incredibly difficult to go through this kind of thing and see the pictures of two incredible, beautiful people crushed into hundreds of pieces and know what they were going through was sheer terror. These trials and parole hearings and everything we have to go through with this brings up in us that elemental horror we have to relive each time, and it's difficult. We do it for the memory of Cheryl and Rob and keep doing what we need to do as families to make sure justice is done. It's really a testament to Cheryl and Rob that people remember them so well. They were such good people and such positive influences that their loss is still felt together by not just the family, but a wide group of people out there. Hopefully, we can close this chapter. Heartbreaking.
And the sad part is that Walsh, Mark's defense attorney, said after he was found guilty again that they will probably appeal it again.
Hopefully they'll get denied that appeal.
I mean, please God.
We can hope.
You know, this is one of those cases too, I think, that's so hard because you're never going to know what really happened. And that's so frustrating. Like, even if one of them told the absolute truth, you wouldn't know. And
Right.
So you're never going to have an answer. And that's, I mean, I think the family would get a little peace knowing that the two people who did it are in prison. But I mean, I don't know how relieving that would be not knowing what happened. Or maybe you don't want to know exactly what happened. I don't.
Yeah, and I think in the end it doesn't bring them back. So
no, it doesn't.
As long as they're both in jail, I'm not sure it matters.
Yeah, I don't like things undone. It doesn't feel good to me.
No, and there's so many cases like that. And I just think even it's not any different in any of these that we do, that they're murderers or criminals, and they're not trustworthy. So I just don't feel like even the ones that we feel are closed and we know everything, we just don't.
Yeah.
Which is exhausting.
It is exhausting. And you know what else I wonder? I wonder why that photo of Cheryl holding onto the limb wasn't shown in the first and second.
Well, I was thinking about that too, and I just wonder if, as you go along and you learn more and more, you notice more and more. I wonder if it wasn't noticed.
Yeah.
Earlier.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that they had hundreds of photos to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
But it's just crazy to me to see that these two people, these two evil men from Texas, come into Idaho County. Two people vacationing in Idaho County get murdered. Yes. And Idaho County is left dealing with the trials. And it's for somebody who, no one who comes from Idaho or Idaho County. And the amount of manpower and work for such a small community is insane to me.
Yeah, I can't even fathom how much work it would have been. And also, I think the amount of emotional strain too that comes along with something that just never goes away. These men somehow manage to pop up every 10 years and drag everybody back into their mess.
Right. And you've got to know that the prosecution and they feel such responsibility to those victims' families. Hopefully there will be an end. Hopefully they're denied if he tries to go get another appeal, but...
Well, wait for this Idaho. And I do want to tell you guys, this may be the most jaw-dropping of the Idahos so far.
So, maybe you're asking yourself what these two assholes ended up costing the taxpayers of Idaho. The answer would be $925,745. That includes $47,735 for Mark Lankford's first trial,
what?
$353,544 for his retrial in Shoshone County. The estimate for Mark's third trial was $200,000, which I think is on the low side, and Brian Lankford's court costs are $170,989. There is also an unidentified amount of $103,477 from 1983 to 1990. But it could possibly have been research, witness, and travel expenses for post-conviction hearings and appeals. And this does not include the cost of housing and feeding them for the last 40 years. It also isn't including the medical, because the county would have paid for all of their medical expenses.
Absolutely. And that, you were right. There is no way that third trial cost $200,000. I'm sure it was twice that. Where I found the numbers, it just said the estimate for the third trial was. Yeah, I'm sure it was twice that. I'm sure it was.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's over $1 million that these two assholes from Texas have cost the taxpayers of Idaho, because they decided that two people needed to die so that they could take their car, because phantom police officers in charge of repos were after them 6 states away from where they lived.
That again just shows how self-important they thought themselves. It's astounding, the stupidity that went into this whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let me pull up my synonym list real quick. So, if anybody wants to write to Brian and Mark, these two loggerheads, about how much money they've cost you, they're both housed at the Idaho State Correctional Facility.
Do with it what you will. So that is the story of the senseless and tragic deaths of Robert and Cheryl Bravens and the two monsters who took their lives for a car. We hope you enjoyed hanging out with us.
If you did, please like and subscribe. It would mean the world. You can find us on Instagram at Ghosts and Garnets Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook. Our page is Ghost and Garnets Murder in Idaho. And if you would like to sponsor our show, you can contact us at ghostsandgarnets@gmail.com.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.